Hello, folks. Welcome to the Two Stewards Show. My name's Mark. I'm here with Brent.
Hi, Mark.
How are you, Brent?
I'm doing all right.
Good to see you, as always.
Yeah, we're on the close side of the table because we have a guest today.
We do. We have Jeff Neven from Indwell. Welcome, Jeff.
Good morning.
Yeah, good to have you with us. I've had you on my hit list for a while, actually. We'll call it that. Interview list is maybe a better term. So, but yeah, you head up Indwell, an organ. Adam, why don't you tell us what Indwell does instead of me botching the description?
Sure. We're a Christian charity that was formed 50 years ago when a family was realizing that people were leaving psychiatric hospital due to deinstitutionalization, and they didn't have the life skills, didn't have the networks, didn't have the tools they needed to thrive in community. We're ending up on the street. So the family started taking people into their home. That wasn't sustainable long term.
Yeah.
And so their church rallied around, helped them buy a home. That started out as a group home here in Hamilton on Locke Street for 25 years. And as things started to change, we realized people needed housing once they left that rehabilitation program. And so we got into purchasing existing apartment buildings, and we got into building apartment buildings. So I think the unique thing about Indwell is we really do three things. We build our own buildings. We are with our sister company Flourish. We develop properties and we get those built. We property manage our own properties, and then the majority of our staff are providing healthcare services to the tenants once they're in our housing to make sure that people have the opportunity to thrive and to set goals and to meet those goals and to have a support wrapped around them to be able to do that.
So this is not just creating housing, it's also support for people. So it's providing them a place to live and supporting them?
That's right.
Yeah? That's
right. It's the basic two criteria for people coming into our housing is you need affordable housing and you desire supports in your life. And so, yeah, we have almost 1,300 people that live with us now across southwestern and southern Ontario. Places like we started here in Hamilton, but also Mississauga, Norfolk County, Woodstock, St. Thomas, London, Kitchener, Project in the Way in Cambridge.
Wow. So,
yeah, we have about we're almost at 350 staff now as well.
Wow. This is quite an operating budget then, too. So, what is the need for Indwell, right? We have, the government provides supports, ostensibly, for homelessness and so forth. So, why do we need an organization like Indwell? What gap are you filling?
Yeah, good question. So I've been with Indwell, actually started as a volunteer back in 2000 and came on as staff in 2001. Back then, there was 3 of us full-time staff. So I've watched things change over the last 24 years, almost 25 years. And as things have changed around us, we've responded to that. So what's changed, 25 years ago, folks who had been deemed to have a permanent disability that would affect their ability to have paid employment, they would receive ODSP, Ontario Disability Support Program, and their housing allowance back then was $450 a month. And
in 2001?
2001.
Okay.
Yeah. And that was the same as what it was actually from the early 90s. It was cut, I think, in 1995 by 20%. So there was a reduction, and then it was basically held flat. But in 2000, for $450, most people with a permanent disability were purchasing their housing from the bottom end of the market.
Yeah.
They could rent a unit for $400, have $50 left for utilities. And so the folks who were coming to us were primarily coming to us for the supports, not necessarily the affordability, because we were on par with the bottom end of the market.
So these people get $450 a month, and that's just for housing, or that's supposed to cover?
Supposed to cover housing and utilities.
Okay.
So fast forward, here we are in 2024, and that has increased to $535. And so no matter where you live in Ontario, the assumption is that you should be able to purchase your housing and your utilities for $535. And then the great irony is the policies are still in place from 30 years ago, where if you didn't spend as much as your housing allowance was, you had to return that back to the government. So you still have to prove that you spent at least $535. The assumption is you spent less and there should be a clawback. So there's, still an ongoing, and if you're homeless and you don't have a rent receipt, that goes to zero. So you don't get that money at all. So you have to have a rent receipt that's higher than that, otherwise you don't get it. So you can imagine what that's done when now the cheapest one-bedroom apartment in the market right now is, if you can find something for $1,500, that's pretty good for a one-bedroom apartment. So there's about $1,000 difference that people have. So you add into that individual's total income, and it's under $1,300, including the housing allowance. So the rent itself is higher than people's total monthly income. So that gap is what our organization has to figure out how to cover. And if we were to build a new unit of housing and not receive any subsidies or any grants or any donations, and we wanted to break even, we'd have to charge $1,900 a month for that unit as well. So that's the cost.
Like you're saying, that would be the bare minimum. Like you couldn't build it cheaper. You couldn't cut corners, like to build to code standards or whatever you got to do to buy the land and to pay the people to build it. That's the kind of minimum that you could rent it for to break even. Oof. Yeah. So going from $450 a month to $535, you said?
$535, yeah.
In 25 years?
We're now at about 35 years, because it's basically been flat since the early 90s. So then the housing price has gone up. Housing prices have gone up far greater than inflation. So what's happened is, you look in my East End, Hamilton neighborhood, there were rooming houses all over the place. We actually have, Indwells purchased a few of those, a couple of nightclubs, strip clubs, rooming houses, and we've turned those into housing, and in some cases even moved people that were living in there back into a new environment, because they're pretty horrible places, human trafficking. One place had a fire and no interior walls, and the guy was still renting out the units. No electricity, no walls. But those places existed. Today, those have all been torn down. They're gone. There is no bottom end of the market. And I used to be appalled by those places. And I still am appalled by those places. But folks who used to live in the bottom end of the market now live in tents and in ravines, in most cases, worse conditions. So the folks that we see, that are in encampments and such today, those folks are competing for units with teachers, nurses. They're competing for the same units, and they're not going to get them, as there's those are in short supply, and the market has very sophisticated ways to figure out who is likely to pay rent and who's unlikely to pay rent. And I think we all agree that someone whose income is less than the rent is unlikely to consistently pay the rent.
Yeah.
and the market would deem that a bad tenant, and you are setting somebody up for failure at that point. And so the need for the type of housing and the affordability in the housing that we provide has increased dramatically. The unfortunate part is that the nonprofit sector has been carved out. Through the 90s, 2000s, we didn't build anything. It doesn't have capacity. It doesn't have, and I'm speaking in general in our sector, it doesn't have the know-how.
Why is that exactly, that it doesn't have the capacity, the know-how?
Good question. So through the 90s and 2000s, the marker of a good nonprofit or charity was how little it spent on administration and fundraising. And so we killed our nonprofit sector.
Right. You want all your dollars, if you're donating, to go to the actual
So things like research and development, capacity, know-how, planners, they all exited our sector. There was no tolerance for things like planning ahead. That was an unnecessary administrative cost. And and we just didn't build anything for a number of decades.
When you say we, do you mean?
I mean the sector.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean the sector, yeah. So if you look at the housing in Canada today, in the non-market housing, more than half of it was built in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So here in Hamilton, over the last 10 years, we averaged 50 units a year is all we've created. And that same time, the market has lost, at the bottom end of the market, units that were affordable. So some of those were deplorable, and we needed to find a solution for those. But others were, I know the house next to mine had 5 apartments in it. The landlord never, ever did any maintenance. The building was in terrible condition. You could put your fingers through the mortar. Tenants complained that they couldn't keep food in their kitchen cupboards because the raccoons were eating them, because they would just free for all through the house. But there was 5 units there, all paying $400 a month. Somebody bought it and fixed it up, and it needed to be fixed up. And now it's 3 units, and I think the cheapest unit there is $2,000, the basement unit. And so that's 5 units that were affordable that are gone. And what happened to those people? I'm
curious, how do you define affordable? We're talking about this with our school too, because we want affordable tuition, right? But that seems to be different for different people. So I'm wondering, like, how do you guys look at what is an affordable place? Or like when you're talking about these units that were affordable, like, is $400 a month affordable, or is that too high for some people still? Or is there kind of a threshold that? Sure.
Well, affordability is relative, right? So, if you make $200,000 a year and spend $150,000 a year on housing, that's not affordable, even though you're making $200,000 a year. So the general kind of guideline is that historically, the general guideline has been 30% of your gross income for housing is considered affordable. Now, today, most of us are above that, but particularly the lower the income that you have, the less of that the rest over left over is available for things like food, clothing, transportation, and so that's the general.
So piece. Roughly one third, kind of allocated to housing costs is.
So at Indwell, we target, we try to get those rents as close to that housing allowance of ODSP. So most of our rents are around $550. We do have a service fee. If we, in some of our programs that are high support, we offer a hot meal a day that people can eat together or take it back to their apartment. Particularly people that are transitioning out of a hospital or out of the street. It's a new experience to cook and have a kitchen of your your own. And so we bridge that with one hot meal a day, and then we'd charge a very low cost, but we'd charge that as well. So some service fees on top of that, $550 rent, and that is what we would call deeply affordable.
Yeah, I mean, when we're renting an apartment, used to be like a third was kind of, we'd look at income and be like, okay, you can afford this because this will be about a third of your gross income. But that doesn't work anymore. Even just, we're not talking about affordable housing, just housing in general, right? We're up around 50%. Right. We don't want to go above that because then we're just setting people up for failure, but we'll accept up to 50% because it's just, I mean, that's just how it is, right? That's the market, and that's the money that's out there, I guess. So
why is that the way it is?
I think that's a good question, right? Yeah. Like, because, if people can have housing at 30% of their income, it means they have a lot more money for other things that really bolsters our economy as well, and takes care of our families and kids. And so I agree with you. I think there's the target. I think 30% is a really good target. We continue to move in the opposite direction as a society, away from that, and what's considered like standard or normal has certainly moved away from that.
Yeah. And I mean, we were talking about this earlier. I mean, I have some thoughts on that, right? We talk often on this show about fiscal responsibility and about the money supply, and how if you kind of look at M2, the money supply in Canada, it goes like, it's not quite a hockey stick, but it's a pretty steep curve, right? And then if you overlay, for example, Toronto housing prices on that, it's almost the identical growth. So, in my opinion, or in my view, I guess, a lot of the affordability issues, they've always existed. So there's some core issues, but it's become much, much worse through the creation of the expansion of the money supply, which has hit everybody, right? Everybody, what we're just talking about, going from looking at, a third of your income for housing to 50%. Like, that's just not at the low end of the market either. This is for some nicer units that we're looking at. And I don't know, Brent, you got some nice units, but I'm sure you've seen kind of the same thing. So to me, the big change recently has been, middle class is kind of being killed. And then anybody who's sort of below that is getting pushed off the edge. And so my theory is that this has contributed to even more homelessness. We're in Hamilton, and you can't drive in the lower city without seeing an encampment, even in the upper city, some parts. So I think that's been a big driver of that. But like, maybe we should talk about the causes of homelessness. Sure. So basic causes, and then what has created, like, I don't know, would you call it a crisis? I would call it a crisis. Yeah. It's gotten worse.
Crisis. Has it been a crisis for how many years?
Yeah. Well, is it just a crisis because now I'm seeing the tents? But it was always a crisis. I just never saw that. What's your opinion?
It's much worse.
Okay.
And that's what people are like, we didn't see this in our cities 5 years ago. And that's true.
Yeah.
So first of all, homelessness is a housing issue, even in the title, right?
Yeah.
And how do you end homelessness is when someone has a home. So at Indwell, we actually spend most of our energy, our resources, in housing people. So there's some fantastic organizations that are doing the crisis sheltering. That's essential, but
it's a temporary
thing.
Yeah.
And when that becomes permanent, when we just keep building more shelters every year and people never have the opportunity or ability to leave them, that's a route that we firmly believe is the wrong direction to go in. When people move into our apartments, they can stay. What we see is that most people move on towards more independence and require less supports. And so we facilitate that with a continuum of different types of housing and different levels of support. But housing needs to be the focus. And as we look across North America, what are the correlations? And the U.S. and Canada have things in common, and so researchers out of Seattle, the University of Washington, there have done some extensive work on saying, like, what causes homelessness? Where are the correlating factors? And because we know that, when you go into my local park, I live by Gage Park in Hamilton, there's over 50 people living in that park today. It's in the news.
It's not very warm out right now.
It is not warm out. And
Warmer underground.
And the news, is of drug busts, of people that are feeding drugs to other people, and that's in the news. So we know that there's definitely a correlation between substances and homelessness. But is that what's causing it? And the research actually says no. It's housing prices. And what drives housing prices, if you look across Canada and the US, it's as the median income, as the majority of the population grows in their income, they can afford more. And it really drives up values. And so if you look at some of the places in the US that have the highest homelessness population, it's places like San Francisco, Boston, Washington, D.C., L.A. They also have the highest incomes. Seattle. Places that have the lowest homelessness, places like Detroit, Chicago, have the lowest homelessness. They also have some of the lowest housing prices. And we see the same in Canada. Places like London, Ontario, that have seen their housing price escalate even higher than what we've seen here in Hamilton. Their homelessness rate is I would suggest even greater than we have here in Hamilton. Whereas places like Regina have a relatively low homelessness rate, and you can buy a house in Regina for $55,000. And so there's a strong correlation there. Places like Detroit, interesting enough though, are on the affordability index, their incomes are really low. So the housing prices kind of correlated to what those incomes look like. If you look at drug use, opioid use, the highest place in North America for opioid use is West Virginia. Guess what else West Virginia doesn't have? Homelessness. They have low cost.
So they have lots of
low cost housing,
but low homelessness. Okay.
And if you've been through West Virginia, you've seen it, right? You've seen the trailers along the side of the road, and lots of people living in very low cost housing. Highest in the U.S. of opioid use, and one of the lowest in homelessness. So what you come to realize, and there's always an anecdotal story, right? When you go and talk to somebody and you realize this person's high, it's drugs that sent them here. Kind of. So when that person is competing for a unit against somebody who's employed, who has an education, who's clean and sober, they have many more things that are stacked up against them to get that unit. They're not going to get, when units become scarce, and especially the affordable ones become even more scarce, there's more competition for them. And those who have the more barriers are going to miss out. And I'm hearing the stories. I'm hearing the stories of folks who were clean when they ended up in an encampment and are no longer clean. Every day that someone spends in an encampment, their life becomes more and more challenged, and not just temporarily challenged, permanently challenged. We have multiple people in our housing today who have no fingers and toes because they froze them off in a tent in the winter here in Canada. Yeah. We can't grow new fingers and toes. That person is now permanently physically disabled, can't even put a hat on, never mind be able to have a job. And that's an outward physical change that happens. But I also know that every night in my park, women are raped Women are sold, women are trafficked, and the cost to human life, the trauma that comes alongside that, in many cases is going to stick with someone for the rest of their life. There is no safety, there is no security when all it takes is to open a zipper of a tent. The drugs today are nothing like we had 10 years ago. One of the side effects that happened with COVID is the borders closed, and most of the drugs were coming, the opioids were coming from plant-based. They were grown in far-off places overseas, and they were being shipped in. When the borders closed, that supply ended, and Canadians are pretty inventive. And they took the gains that we as a society have in pharmaceuticals, and they realized they can actually make synthetic opioids, and you can make them in every neighborhood. Every suburban neighborhood in Canada and the US is making synthetic opioids, and they're far, far stronger. They're really cheap, and because they're made just down the street, they're really easy to get, and they're not coming in boatloads and airplane loads. They're coming in backpacks and socks, and so we're certainly seeing the effects of the drug crisis as well. Is in the last 5 years, that's really, really changed.
Yeah, I mean, we just on the I guess on the fentanyl side of things. I mean, we talked to Sam Cooper. I don't know if you know him. He's an investigative journalist, and he really documented this even before Trump is going off about the fentanyl that's coming from Canada to the States, and it's become a hot button issue. But he pointed this out like a number of years ago in a book that he wrote as well, right? That China especially is a huge source of precursors, and they're shipping it in to Canada for distribution throughout, and for various reasons. But one of them, I think, is just to subvert our society here, right? If we're a weaker society, we're less competition for them. And there's a whole bunch of geopolitical stuff at play here. But yeah, you're right. Fentanyl is way, way cheaper to make, right? Like cocaine, any other, even other synthetic stuff, right? It's so cheap. So, yeah, that's something that we've seen sort of on a broader scale as well, right? And you're seeing it more in the specific context of like a very local context, what that actually does. So, okay, so what are, just going to basics, what are some of the causes of homelessness in general? So we've talked about affordability, and that's a huge one, right? That's, yeah, as things are less affordable, people are just pushed on the street because they can't get a unit. Like what else? I mean, so the typical
the only reason for homelessness is a lack of a home.
Okay, right.
That is the only reason.
West Virginia, where there's a lot of.
It's the only reason. The question is, like, what's keeping people
will opt to have a home if there is one. Like
absolutely.
Seek it out.
But what the more vulnerabilities you carry, the more likely you're going to be homeless. So, do you have a mental health issue like schizophrenia? Do you have Down syndrome? Do you have cerebral palsy? Do you have a disability of any sort that keeps you from being full-time employed?
Just another thing, how do you define a home then? Because like a tent would not be a home.
No.
But like, you think of the Bible times, like the Israelites lived in tents. They're probably much more like a different climate or a different lifestyle or whatever, different kinds of tents. But like, where does the line go? Like you mentioned these trailers in West Virginia, like how does a home get defined?
Sure. So I would say, it's a place that meets your needs. So it provides you shelter. It has appropriate temperature. But there's a lot of different, what that looks like. It could be 6 guys renting a 3-bedroom house together.
Yeah.
There's lots of creative ways that people find home, and it could be, my wife and I have 4 kids, and I know what home looks like for me. It's in a old house that was run down, and we've fixed up in East Hamilton, and that's what home looks like for me. Yeah. And so I think, a tent in a park is never home. No. The lack of access to basic things like water and sewage, that's not a home. So I would open that definition up and offer that there is lots of different opportunities and varieties for home. Yeah. I think choice has to have a piece in that.
Because where I'm going with this, what I'm thinking is like, okay, if I actually want to build a home or create a home for somebody who maybe is living on $500 a month, like, how can I comply with current building code standards, or like, you know what I mean? Or pay the trades or the people that have to do the work to comply, and then design it and whatever else, and then hook into the city sewers and whatever. Like, are we pricing that out because like maybe regulation or codes are too restrictive, or is that like, how does Indwell deal with that?
So I think fundamentally, like, for people who we as a society have deemed permanently disabled, we need to have a higher housing allowance. It's got to be higher, and ironically, who's also going to benefit from that? It's the market, who used to provide housing. Right. Rent is a rent subsidy is the best way to have dollars recirculate in our economy. They don't get spent elsewhere; they get spent here. And if you're worried about how people spend their money, well, it's on rent. So I do think that actually, to answer your question, I don't think you can find a way that the market can provide housing for $550. So we have to drive up what people's housing allowance is, so that you can come in and have some options in the $1,400, $1,500 range.
I'm just thinking, if I got like a few trailers that were old and I put them on a lot in Hamilton, found a vacant lot and just put like 50 trailers, like the city would come down. Like, they wouldn't approve that as a housing, but that would be to some people a much better home than. I'm just thinking out loud. Really
sure, trailer parks have formed, been housing, and we see that still as an option in a lot of the U.S.
Is it just our culture doesn't like tolerate that sort of?
If we call them tiny homes, then we like them.
Then it's cool.
Yeah. But no, I believe we got to have all kinds of options of housing, and one of the things I'm excited about is the movement of secondary dwellings, and intensification in our neighborhoods. What I love about them is it's like. It's us, the citizens, finding solutions within our control, and it's doable for most households who've owned their house for more than 10 years. It's gone up in value, and there's equity in the home. And if you have a basement or a garage, or if you have any backyard at all, you can create a secondary dwelling. And along with that, you can build a secondary dwelling even with a sewer hookup and things for $200, $250 maybe, depending on how you're outfitting it. Compared to multi-residential construction, that's incredibly affordable. We're using land that we already have. We're using streets, sidewalks that we already have. So I'm a really big fan of secondary dwellings. I think the other piece in addition to that comes with it, is, if a family opens up a dwelling in their backyard, you start by sharing the backyard, and then maybe share a barbecue. And then you find out that the person who's living there doesn't have a family doctor, and you do, and you ask your family doctor if they'll take them on as a client. And all these spillover social effects that happen when we're in proximity with each other. I think that's one of the biggest things that we can do as well that are
yeah, because I think to a lot of people, like building a house in their backyard, or I just talked to a fellow this week he has a basement apartment or a basement that's unfinished, and he's like, I was like, what do you use it for? He's like, oh, storage. Like, so how often do you go down there? He's like, never. My daughter goes down there once in a while. It's like, would you ever convert it to a unit? It's like, no. Like, you just need the space, right? I have this like, I don't want to degrade my lifestyle and share my space with another person.
Yeah.
But then the flip side, there's like the social benefits of having community and having people around and like close to you and interacting and helping and serving. And
I think it is certainly one of the social constructs that we're fighting against here in North America, is this sense that we each need to have like 1,000 square feet of our own. Yeah. I'm a second generation immigrant, and I hear some of the stories of the first generation immigrants that came after coming out of a war-torn country, and they just took people in. And today we still have folks who are coming out of war-torn countries that are doing that. You know, you're living in a 3-bedroom house, and there's the grandparents, the grandkids, and the former neighbor from back home is living with you with their kids as well. And but today, most of us in Canada really want to have about 1,000 square feet per person.
Yeah.
So going back to the accessory dwelling units, you're talking about you could build it in your backyard and house somebody. Are you suggesting that this is affordable housing, or are you just suggesting that this is it's additional housing, and that by creating more and more housing, because like we have a housing shortage as well, right? We're hundreds of thousands of units short in Canada. So would you suggest that someone builds that and then rents it out below market, or are you just saying just build it, rent it out, cover your costs, and that will increase the overall housing pool?
Yeah, I think in each opportunity it's different, right? So if you have the means to help somebody have housing that if you have the cash and you're not borrowing it, your cost to build that is much cheaper. Yeah. Yes, you're foregoing an investment somewhere else, but you can pass that along to somebody. Somebody else might not have that, and they're borrowing against the equity in their house, and they have to cover that mortgage. I'm not saying that you got to go into poverty yourself, but you can use that resource. I said homelessness is a housing issue. We need a lot more housing. And the nature of accessory dwellings, they're typically smaller. So they're, by that nature, it's never going to be a $4,000 a unit or a month rental. It's going to be at the low end. So I think the more options we create for people, the better. I'm not one who's going to dictate to someone who builds it what the rent should be or who they should house. But I would say, asking the questions, who needs help? And can you afford to help someone? And those are good questions to ponder. Yeah. There's groups, like here in Hamilton, Open Homes is one of my favorite groups. Ironically, one of their founders lives a block from here, and she's connecting people with empty bedrooms in their houses with refugees who are coming in and who don't have a place to go. And they've placed over 100 people into people's homes. They partner that with a mentor. So if there's any kind of a third party that can help with things, it's an incredible opportunity. And who's opening up their homes? Some of them are, young families who bought a 3-bedroom, but it's just a couple, and they're like, we don't have any kids yet, and but we got some empty bedrooms. Some of them are folks who are empty nesters, and their kids are gone and they got empty bedrooms. And so thinking about how we use our assets, that's not for everybody to share their house. I think about other groups like IMBY in my backyard, who's doing, I think, their second build here in Hamilton. doing.
And that's
very
that's a
intentional.
play on NIMBY, like
That's right.
Not in
Yeah.
my backyard.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've heard of that, but
Or YIMBY.
NIMBY.
Yes, in my backyard.
Yes.
It's
Yep.
another
Okay.
variation.
And
So-
and they're building their very intentionally. In that case, they're getting donated materials, donated labor, and they're really driving down the cost of those units so that they can be rented at a break even. But the break even's really affordable.
So, like a lot of what I'm hearing from you right now is this is citizens, this is people doing things, right? And making decisions and being intentional about it without really support from the government. I mean, there are some supports for building accessory dwelling units. There may be more federal stuff coming. We'll hear about that with the fall economic statement. But I'm just thinking about, well, myself or what listeners might think. When we're talking about homelessness, right, a lot of people will view it as like, why are we spending so many resources, like tax dollars? I'm talking about government spending now. Why do we spend so much on these people who don't want to help themselves, right? And I'm not saying this is true, but this is, I'm sure you've come across this, right? You have people who are addicted to drugs, and if they just get their stuff together and figure it out, then they would be able to afford a house or an apartment or whatever. And so, I mean, I've read a little bit. I don't know if it was you or maybe an article. I can't remember now, but somebody talking about the difference between involuntary treatment and supportive housing, and how really it's the same thing without the involuntary aspect of it, right? So when you take somebody off the streets and get them into a drug rehab program, and then they have housing, they've got heat and water and some, maybe some supports for people like therapy or counselors or whatever. And they do that and they get clean and it's great. And then they're back out on the street. So a lot of people would say, like, it's not my problem. Like, they just got to get their stuff together. But I'm thinking in terms of, well, so number one, is that the right attitude? Number two, in terms of tax dollars being spent, we're doing a lot of involuntary treatment. When the difference between that and the supportive housing is just it's not involuntary. This is people who want to change their life a little bit and who need some help. Is there a case to say we should put more tax dollars towards that instead of the involuntary treatment? And would that result, like longer term, would that be more financially sustainable? Because now you've got people who are maybe productive as opposed to people who are, I'm not saying everybody has to be like, yeah, you can define what's productive.
So you got about 5 questions.
That's what I do. I just shotgun it.
And I'm trying to unpack them in a few different ways. So first I want to start with why is someone turning to substances?
Yeah.
And we talk about the opposite of addiction is connection.
Yeah.
People turn to substances to dull the pain of their reality, to flee their current reality. And one of the things we see is that as soon as someone's reality starts to change with having a home, the need to flee from that reality decreases. And we see that substance use actually just decreases on day one. It doesn't mean you're sober, doesn't mean you're clean, but it decreases because that which is driving you to substances decreases. I'm a Christian, and I live out of a belief that there's a bigger story, that's a story filled with hope, and that life is on a trajectory, and our world's on a trajectory of being redeemed and made right. When I meet people who are homeless and are looking for housing, there is no hope. There's no sense of worth, value, so I would say we have to start there. I think one of the biggest fights we have right now, when COVID started, people were compassionate to those who are homeless. Today, there is no compassion left.
Why is that?
I think people see the results of what happens when people are homeless. They got nothing to lose anymore. So therefore, rules, laws don't apply. I see it on my street, right? Like none of our neighbors can keep a propane tank attached to their barbecue because they're needed at the end of the street for heat.
Yeah.
And man, do those things blow up when there's a tent fire, and it's dangerous. When my wife walks our dog through the park and it eats human feces again, you go, I don't want this in my park. So I think but if you ask folks who are living in the park, is this the ideal for you? Is this what you want? No. They don't want to be there either. Who thinks it's a great idea to have at Main and King in the median there's been, a dozen people living there for 2 years with no water, no sewer. Who thinks this is a good idea? It's not a good idea. It's a public health nightmare. It's not compassionate to leave people in that state. So I think people rightly are upset. Those who are dealing with the homelessness are now being blamed. It's their fault. They need to fix their own situation. And their life doesn't matter, is I think the biggest fight that we have is, a third of Canadians believe that if you are homeless, that should qualify you for medical assistance in dying. A third of Canadians believe that.
Wow.
Homelessness is
sad. That's got to be a recent thing, right? Because MAID is...
That was reported a year ago in the National Post.
Wow.
Homelessness is temporary. It's solvable. And actually not even that expensive compared to other infrastructure. Just compare it. Hamilton apparently needs a new water treatment plant. And they said it's probably going to be about $500 million. It made it into the newspaper once on page like 10 or 11. No one's talking about it. And we know it's not going to be $500 million. By the time it comes around, it's going to be $1.5 billion.
Yeah.
No one is talking about, can you believe we're going to spend $1.5 billion on a new water treatment? We go, well, we need it. We have no choice but to go out to tender, find out what it costs, and then find the money to build it and go. We don't do the same thing with housing and homelessness. Each government goes, what do I need to throw into the pot to make it look like I'm doing something? This week, we heard an announcement of $50 million for supportive housing in the province. That is fantastic. To solve homelessness across Ontario for $50 million in capital doesn't get us very far. And no one is actually starting with a vision of, hey, we want to get everybody off the street. And we want to do that with housing. What's that going to cost? So I think there's a sense of, of justice. Those people are taking from me. They should be punished. Force them into treatment. There's virtually no study around addictions in particular that forced treatment is effective. If you've ever tried to go on a diet because your wife told you need to go on a diet,
I may have some experience with that.
it's pretty ineffective, right? Yeah. You have to want to lose weight, otherwise it's not going to work. We can talk about treatment in mental health as a kind of a separate category. There are situations and provisions where we can take away someone's human rights and say, no, you need to have treatment. But there we need to have that conversation. We have folks going into treatment every single day. One hospital, St. Joseph's Hospital alone, discharges 12 people to homelessness every single day. These are folks who we have spent significant resources on treatment, helping folks. And that's treatment for all kinds of different things. That could be mental health treatment, it could be addiction treatment, it could be for infection, it could be for whatever the treatment is. But when you discharge people back to the place that made the mill in the first place, the treatment doesn't stick. It's a waste of resources. It's ineffective, and I hope we can get back to the day where we're catching people coming out of treatment who otherwise would become homeless and move those folks into housing, because if they got to do a stint in a tent first and experience more harm, more illness, more addiction, more violence. We actually there's it makes recovery so much more difficult. So I don't know if that helps answer some of your questions around that.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, one is just strictly the economic view.
Sure.
So what you're
and I can give you numbers on that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, like, because what you're describing is someone who's going to be in a cycle.
Yep.
And never get out of that.
Yep.
Whereas I think what you're trying to do is to help break that cycle with Indwell, if I can be painting broad strokes here, like end that cycle. And yeah, it costs money.
Yep.
But what is the cost of that versus a lifetime of in and out of St. Joe's, for example?
Yep.
So
let's just talk about cost for a second. A day in a hospital is about $1,500. So that's the most expensive. The next most expensive is jail. It's hard to get a number on that, but it's around $200 per person per day to stay in a jail. And that doesn't offer you treatment. But it does give you warmth and dry and shelter. Shelter, Hamilton's building some tiny cabins, so you don't get a bathroom. You get a shed, an insulated shed, and a communal bathroom on the site. The cost of those is $180 per person per day, is what we're not on the capital, just on the operating. That's all I'm talking is operating here.
Okay.
For Indwell, we have some buildings that are as low as $25 per person per day, and our most intensive, which also includes, if we need to include financing to be able to build the capital, is $175. And that's for a very, very intensive treatment program. But if you average out across the whole spectrum, even if we have to borrow a couple $100,000 per unit to build them, on average, we're $95 per person per day. So if you don't care about people, let's just say, I know you guys do, and you just say, what is the most pragmatic way to solve this from a money point of view? Supportive housing is it. It's the cheapest by far. We can we can provide housing and supports to 3 times as many people as a shelter for the same price. And when you're in shelter, you're still homeless. When you're in jail, you're still homeless. When you're in hospital, you're still homeless.
And if you do care about people, it's still the best way.
It's still the best way. Yeah.
I saw that coming.
Well, I mean, like, the reason I'm going down a very pointed questions about this is because some people you will not. I mean, so if you're not Christian, you don't really care. I'm not saying that people who aren't Christian don't care about others, but there's a sort of a unique viewpoint here. But if you're just looking at the money, and because this is often the argument, right? Like, why are we spending so much on these homeless people, right? So you're saying $1,500 a day in hospital versus maybe a couple $100, and so chances are that's going to free up hospitals like healthcare for other stuff. We complain about healthcare. I complain about healthcare all the time. That just means that lessens that load over the long term.
And then let me give you an example, because I think it's one of the best examples we have in Canada right now is St. Thomas, Ontario. So St. Thomas and Elgin counties, about 120,000 people or so. So it's a small city, and their homelessness rate was significant, and part of that is because of a long history of they had a regional psychiatric center in St. Thomas, and when people left there, they're still struggling with mental health and such, and so their level of homelessness was quite high in St. Thomas, and if you had driven down through their downtown, Stores didn't want to be downtown. They were mostly empty, vacant, and we're seeing this in lots of downtowns today. When people have to step over someone who's passed out in your doorway, it's not great for business. It's not great for the person passed out, and it's not great for business. When people are have addictions that need to be fed, crime goes up. And the mayor and the council of St. Thomas said, we need to make this our priority. We are going to end homelessness. And they did this.
I've heard that before.
They did this right before COVID and right before all these challenges of the opioid crisis and such. So they didn't even know what was coming. And but everybody got on board. All the social service agents. We came up with a plan. We got involved. The police chief said, we're not going to fine our way out of this. Giving out more fines to homeless people doesn't change anything.
Yeah.
Putting them in the back of a police cruiser and then go, now where do I drop this person off? Doesn't change anything. So we worked together. We got some federal money to build some housing above their transit office that was empty. They identified what they had. And we started a very intensive program, 15 units with about 12 staff on site. That's a pretty intensive supportive housing treatment program. And we worked together to identify the 15 hardest to house. So people who'd been chronically homeless for over 10 years. We talk about acuity level. So that means what are the various vulnerabilities that someone might have. So, it might be somebody with schizophrenia, an opioid addiction, alcoholism, diabetes, an amputated leg, all in one person. And so we found identified the 15 hardest to house. Our staff went into ravines, did intakes under tarps, and moved all 15 people inside. And so this notion that people don't want help, sometimes they don't trust you. Sometimes it takes a little longer. Sometimes the options that we offer people aren't as good, right? Like, hey, you can have a night in jail, or you can stay in your tent. I'm staying in my tent. If you've ever been in a shelter, most shelters are head to toe cots, bunk beds, overcrowded. There's violence. They're single gender. So if I'm in a tent with my wife, she has to go to one end of town. I got to go to the other. Well, I can tell you, if I'm homeless, there's no way I'm leaving my wife's side. Mm-hmm. I'm going to protect her because it is dangerous out there. So if I were homeless, I'd be in a tent, for sure. And so sometimes you have to help people to see what a better option is. And so it took us a little bit longer for some, a couple months for some people to convince them to come inside. Some had an apartment, and the first week they didn't sleep there because they just didn't feel right. But we got them all inside, and within 3 months, they moved in the beginning of October. By the end of the year, and this is now 3 years ago. By the end of the year, all were on medically supervised treatment programs for their addictions, and so it meant that the police chief told me this. He said most people who have an opioid addiction, they need about $60 per person per day to feed that. To get that, you need to steal about $600 worth of things because you don't get full value for a bicycle. So we eliminated that level of crime. And I'm not saying that these 15 individuals were stealing, but I'm saying in general, that's what the police chief was telling me is what it requires to feed an addiction. And folks were housed. And it was January, the local police officer came by to say goodbye. We're like, where are you going? She goes, I'm being reassigned. What are you talking about? She goes, well, since you house these 15 folks, our police calls are way down. And so we don't need to actually have a police officer here. They have a patrol person that's not a full police officer, which is cheaper. And we said, tell us more. And she goes, well, let me go run the numbers. And because it's a small city, they knew who we'd housed, and they just ran the numbers. And in the first 9 months, those 15 individuals had just under 1,000 police calls. In the 3 months they were with us, the first 3 months, that went down to 63. So, 330 per quarter down to 63. And that was just the beginning. And it took us within 2 years, 40% of those folks moved to further independence. A year later, another 40% moved towards more independence, and we're taking more people in together. And we built another building there. The city had expropriated land for a fire hall, and they gave us the land. They paid for the fire hall, and we built housing above it. So we own a fire hall that we lease for free back to the city there. And St. Thomas is one of the few places in Canada that year over year we continue to have a net reduction in homelessness, and it works. And it works. I would suggest it's it worked really well there because their mayor and their council were all on the same page. They didn't separate around partisanship. Their mayor is a conservative. He was a minister in the Harper government, and they just said this is the right thing to do. And actually, then the Chamber of Commerce has gotten on board. They've since held conferences, and they even came to Hamilton to hold a conference here with all the other Chamber of Commerce around Ontario. And under the tagline that they had is social issues are business issues. And they talked about the improvement in their economy due to helping people. And we're not talking massive amounts of people.
What was the number? Do you know in St. Thomas how many people were homeless roughly?
Yeah, I don't have that number on hand right now. I think we were talking a couple of hundred.
Okay.
Yeah. And so we're now building our third building in St. Thomas. And as people are progressing through and becoming more independent, that's what our third building will be is we call it our standard support. Basically, it's a housing support worker who's there when people need support. They reach out and we help them. But compared to our high support team, which has nurses, addictions workers, food security, housing, all on site, you can see there too the cost. So when people start being able to have their own agency to be able to take care of themselves, that's also cost effective. And so, when we look at sheds versus apartments, in a shed with a shared bathroom, you got to pay people to come in and clean that bathroom 3-4 times a day. When someone has their own apartment, they clean their own bathroom.
Yeah.
When you got to bring food to people because they don't have a kitchen, you got to feed people 3 times a day versus helping people to live in proximity to a grocery store where you can go buy your own cereal or bagel or whatever and care for yourself. So as people develop their own agency and ability to do that, it also drives down costs.
So I'm just thinking, right, St. Thomas, you're treating probably not treating, but you're providing housing for probably a few dozen people, it sounds like.
Well, when this new building's up, we'll be housing about 150 people.
Okay, but even for what you have now, you've seen a net improvement,
so right now
across the board.
Yeah, right now we're trying to remember the exact number. I think we're around 65 units that we have in St. Thomas.
Yeah,
and it's us and it's the system but it's a goal and a plan, and their goal is to shut down the shelter.
Yeah.
And whereas every other city is like, we need to increase our shelters, and there's always going to be, I think, people in crisis and need to have a crisis.
What gives them that mindset though, that they want to shut down the shelter? And why do other municipalities, like you would think other municipalities would be giving you guys
short-term versus long-term thinking?
Okay, so they have a long-term mindset.
Yep.
And that comes from?
It comes from politicians who've been in a seat for a while and aren't thinking about, I need to have a quick, I need some quick credit here for the next election. Right. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges I'm seeing in healthcare, in homelessness. No one is making a plan.
Yeah.
I'm not hearing in most cities even a vision of saying we need to end homelessness, or we need to end encampments, and we need to do it in a compassionate way. They're not even starting with a vision. They're starting with, I got $1. What can you do with it?
Right.
And can I get a photo op for this? And it's every government, it's every, and it's every party that's into these short-term wins.
Yeah, just because the incentives are such that if you don't, you won't get elected and you can't do anything. Yeah.
And they're not asking the question, how do we make a better society? Who do we want to be? They're saying, how much will it cost me to appease the population to make us think that we did something?
So in Hamilton, do you have a rough idea of the number of homeless people in Hamilton? Because we live in Hamilton, that's where we are.
Yep. So there's two definitions for that. So those who are living outdoors, living rough, there's about the last number I heard was 350. I think it's higher than that. And that's just based on biking around my neighborhood and along the escarpment. And but let's just run with that 350 number. In addition, there's folks who are in shelters, in jail, who are coming out and have nowhere to go, who are in hospital, who are coming out and have nowhere to go, who, so we're I think the last number I heard there was around 5,000 more people, 5,000 households. Those are measured in households.
So that's more people.
More people, yeah.
Wow,
yeah.
That's a big number.
But if you look at the 350, that's actually a finite number, and it's not that big. Hamilton has, I would go so far to say, the strongest housing organizations in Canada. And together, we have, with us, the YWCA, Good Shepherd, Wesley, Sacagawea, we have projects in various stages of pre-construction that could house 450 people.
So these are projects that are ready to go now in the next year. Like, how long are we talking?
Yeah, so I'll talk about ours. We have where are we at? Probably 6-8 sites in Hamilton in different stages. One would be building permit is sitting at City Hall, but to pick it up, we have to pay a whole bunch of fees. So we're just letting it sit there. But, almost building permit in hand, to other ones where we have, the zoning and everything in place, just need final building permit approval, but, could get it within 90 days kind of thing. So I'd call those construction ready. To other ones that are, very early preliminary sites that need a lot of effort and work yet. We just bought, with some partners, we bought the old Century Manor, which is an old hospital.
Right building. Next to the St. Joe's, which is like, wow.
Yeah. So we're working, but that'll take some time to, one of our partners owns it, Schlegel Village, with a very complicated agreement to then split it up for our portion, a private housing development portion, and a Mohawk College is the other one. So some of those are pretty complicated. There's a lot of environmental cleanup on that site. The old buildings that were there were just flattened but not cleaned up. So environmental remediation, zoning, those kind of things on some of them can take a couple of years. And then it comes down to predictability. If we knew there was funding at the end of the tunnel, we would get working on getting those. But, all of those stages cost a lot of money. And so we could only put so much money out there.
Where does your funding come from? We could talk about that.
Sure.
That's a good.
I mean, it sounds like you've got the staff, you've got the expertise, like you can do the development, the zoning, the everything. You get it to that. We just got to pay for the building permit. So it sounds like the bottleneck is funding. Is that right?
Yeah, the bottleneck is funding, and I call it lasagna layers of funding.
So I like lasagna.
I don't like this one because we're missing a few layers. There are a number of programs in place. The federal government has a program, but through CMHC, but it gets us a layer.
Right.
We always start the base layer that we always start with is us as citizens. That's why Indwell exists. It's people coming together through the form of a charity to make the community we want, to care for the people that we know need caring for. So we start with donations always. So most of our projects are 10-15% is donations that we start with. Then we work with the municipality. What do you have? What can you contribute? Can you waive some fees?
Because at the end of the day, you're not trying to make a profit here. You're trying to create a housing solution. And
That's right.
offer
Making a
support.
social profit, I would argue, right?
There's a social benefit
Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah.
And any dollar that we can save gets passed directly on to our renters. So then we add on to there the provincial and federal government. These days, the provincial and federal government are at a race to be last to the table. They like to come in at the very end and say, hey, we made this happen, once everybody else has done all the heavy lifting. But without that predictability, it's really tough because we're essentially building on spec, hoping that the lasagna will be all the layers will be there when it's time to drop it in the oven. And
Have you had projects that didn't materialize because of lack of funding?
yeah,
or-
so one that makes me really
it seems
sad.
like a bit of a risk, right?
It is a risk.
Yeah.
One that makes me sad is we bought an elementary school in Chatham a couple of years ago, and we worked really hard. The community raised money. We got it rezoned. We applied for federal funding through the Rapid Housing Initiative, and we didn't get the funding. And we couldn't attract the attention to Chatham as a small city from the province and the federal government to get the money there. And we couldn't hold it anymore. And one of our donors had actually lent us the full amount of money to buy the place interest-free. So it wasn't our money that we were spending, but it was one of our donors' money. And every month that we sat on that, it was money that he was missing out on. And so we could only go for so long. And so we ended up selling that to the municipality. We sold it to Chatham, and they're holding it to eventually make it into affordable housing. But that would be one case. I think that's one of the only cases where we've had to sell. We have 30 other projects that have gone positively.
Yeah.
And even there, we were fortunate enough to be able to, the value of that property actually went up. And when we rezoned it, the value went up. So the appraised value actually had gone up, and we were able to exit out of there with a break even covering our costs. But the homelessness situation in Chatham continues to get worse. And so we haven't left Chatham, but that particular project we no longer own.
So, okay, so I think we've covered sort of the financial. I really wanted to be comprehensive about that because there's, it's hard to get buy-in if people don't. I don't know. Looking at from my perspective, if I don't see like a net financial benefit, and even like success stories, like you're talking about St. Thomas, when you can say like, look, we have a thesis. And then we've proved that thesis and that it actually works, right? Because it's one thing people have good intentions to do all kinds of things, and a lot of them don't materialize. But you say, we have a working, effective thing. Financially, it makes sense for the community, for the government, for et cetera. But then, like, look at the lives that are changed as well, right?
That's right.
Like, it's not just a numbers story. It's people's lives.
Yeah.
Like, how, I don't know, if it was your mother, your brother
Totally.
on the street, right? Like, imagine that. So, as Christians, like we have a duty. We don't. It's not like an optional thing, right? And to help, right? We have commands to take care of the widow and the orphan, and we can kind of extrapolate like what that means, right? It's the poor. Jesus said, "You will always have the poor with you." There is always going to be an opportunity to do that work. So, how, like, what's an effective way for Christians to get involved then?
Yeah.
And maybe specifically with Indwell, and maybe there's other things, but like so one obvious one is like, we can give money. So that's great. I can give money, feel good. And, but like, are there other more material ways that people can be involved in this?
Yeah, that's a good question. And you got me thinking about the passage that always rumbles in my head is Isaiah 1. And if you've read that recently, it's God through the prophet is saying, I'm tired of your religion. I'm tired of your festivals, and thinking, we're heading into Christmas, and I wonder if God's tired of all the commercialization and the theatrics around this festival. And he says, rather than do all these new moon festivals, and we call it New Year's, what about, what I want from you? Seek justice, defend the oppressed, take care of the widow, take care of the orphan. That's what I want from you. All the rest, like, I'm done with. And that's with me. I also, a passage that chases me is in James 2. And it says, what good is it if we say, what good is our faith? If we say, be well fed, be sheltered. And I have that on a daily basis where I speak to people who are unhoused in my neighborhood. And I always leave with some sort of way of making myself feel better. Like, well, I hope you have a good day. Yeah. I hope this. And it's like, so what can we do? I wrestle with that every day. I think certainly donations is very easy to do. And I would encourage people, go to our website, donate. But I think what Jesus calls us to do is to think about how we do business, what's important in our cities, who we care about, who we speak up for, who we live next to, where we intend to be. I was in despair talking about my neighborhood. Is like, this isn't right. This isn't right that every night women are raped in my park and there's a pimp who's overseeing it all. It's just not right. And that we can't, keep a propane tank in our backyard. That I went to put my winter tires on, somebody stole them. Wow. Like, out of my backyard, right? Yeah. But I can afford new tires, but it's annoying. And a friend of mine who lives outside the city said to me, he's like, why don't you just move? And that's crossed my mind. Why don't we just move? And I blurted out right to him without even thinking. I said, because I don't think my neighborhood would be better without me. So when I think about this calling that we have as Christians, it's all encompassing. It's who we choose to be in proximity with, who we choose to have relationship. Out of that, we come to find out who our neighbor really is. That intentionality. So I would just, encourage people more than anything. Get to know people different than yourself. Be intentional. Sometimes you need a pathway to do that, like volunteering somewhere. We, as part of our maintenance team at Indwell, we have volunteers who do maintenance, unit turnovers, that door that got caught in the wind and needs to be fixed and replaced. And with 1,300 units, we have a lot of buildings and a lot of maintenance that has to happen every single day. So that's one way that people get in proximity with people, and you come and volunteer and you get to know people, and you know when they're doing well and when they're not doing well, and you ride that kind of journey alongside people. And then there's like really kind of creative ways that we can look at the bigger kind of macro picture of things. Something that we just did kind of inadvertently. Our first building project that we did, we naively thought that government would pay when they said they were going to. I don't know why we thought that was reasonable. But I can't even remember if it was the provincial or federal government now. They owed us $350,000.
I think it is reasonable to expect that. And they were just being unreasonable.
And they kept telling us, it's coming next week. And when someone tells you it's coming next week, what do? You hold off on paying a bill. Right? That's how you cash flow something for a week. Well, 1 week turned into 3 weeks, turned into 2 months, and we got to pay these bills. And how are we going to do this? I reached out to a farmer that I worked for growing up. His name is Harry Vandermarl from Dundas. And I said, Harry, I need to borrow some money. I got to pay these bills. And the federal government, I think they're good for it. I probably just need it for a couple of weeks. And so he lent me the money. And we paid the bills, and it turned into a year before we got our money. And in the meantime, I think it was 2007 when the stock market collapsed. He had sold his farm and put this money with us. And he, at the end, he said, I lent it to you because it was the right thing to do, and it turned out to be my best investment. And from there, others joined. And before you knew it, we had 180 people who'd quietly lent us $30 million. And that allowed us to buy property, get it zoned, get it ready, get through construction to deal with that. And these are just your average person. And so we've now formalized that. This past April, we went out with a social impact bond for $5 million to get 3 projects here in Hamilton up to construction ready. And people responded right away. So within 6-8 weeks, we had already filled our 5 million, and there was more interest. So we expanded it to 6 million, and now that's full. Wow. But it's got us thinking about, are we just going to wait for government to solve things, or are we going to figure it out on our own? And
yeah, I was just thinking you're almost replacing the government in the services you're providing.
Well, I don't think government should be providing service in this space at all, to be quite frank.
Yeah.
They can pay for it, and taxation is a reasonable form to get us to a service that we all need. But I don't think government should be in this space. I think that it's nonprofits in the third sector are best positioned to do this. The interesting thing is banks in the traditional finance system is not interested in this space at all. I was just in Ottawa a couple weeks ago at the Ontario Not-for-Profit Housing Association conference. Not one bank was there. Van City out of Vancouver was there.
They're more of a creative lender?
Yeah, but that was it. None of the big banks. And you think, in this room, we have 300 million in assets. And in this room, we're not alone. So there's probably 10, 20, 30 billion dollars worth of assets in that room, and banks weren't even interested. Wouldn't even come to the
I think it's in the title, not for profit. I think that's where the banks are like, nope. So
okay, we know where we stand. So then we, as citizens, as people, can figure out new ways. And so we're looking at some new options as well. We're looking at municipalities are asking questions like, if we gave you 7 acres, what could you do with it?
Right.
And we have always created what we call knowable size communities. We like apartment buildings in the 50, 60 kind of unit that people all know each other.
Yeah.
Know who's supposed to be there, who's not supposed to be there. So when you're looking at 7 acres, we're not going to put necessarily 800 units of supportive housing.
Cram as much density as you can.
Well, I think we'd cram density, but we want to have a mixed, diverse community. And so we're looking at new ways about how we can create more housing. If homelessness is a result of lack of housing, which I've told you it is, then housing is the answer to that. And the intentionality, though, around those who are going without housing. I don't believe in the that it's worked over the last 20 years. The trickle down effect has been, hey, let's build more housing for the higher end. They'll move out of the lower end, and it'll trickle down to those who need the most. Well, that hasn't worked. We need to have intentionality around, particularly those with the least. So we're looking at new ideas, and how can we? I'm not satisfied with the fact that this year we only opened 2 new buildings. One's our own, one that we're running for the city of Hamilton, and we only have one project under active construction right now, and I'm not satisfied with that. We need to figure out a way that we can build 300 units next year, and then 400, and then 500, and build the governance structure and the mechanisms possible that we're building 1,000 units a year across southwestern Ontario, because then we can actually get on top of this.
Yeah, so it sounds like you're building out a long-term solution, and you're thinking long-term, and your partners, the government, are not on the same page. Like, they're not thinking long-term, so it's going to take some convincing to get those things to work.
Yeah,
like does the system need to change? Or?
Well, I think the nice part is we're not competing with a vision that government has, because they don't have one. So we can create.
That's the problem, vision. I guess they don't have the long term.
I'm saying that tongue in cheek, right? Look at CMHC. They make $1 billion a year in profit from their mortgage insurance. Of the money allocated to them over the last number of years, every year they underspend by $500 million that's already been allocated towards housing. So the money's been allocated in the budget and they're not spending it. So I'm not even asking for
extra.
Let's just use the money that's already been allocated.
Yeah.
And let's use it as creatively as we can. And let's bring as many different partners to the table as we can. And get going. This lasagna layer of funding that I talked about, right? Like, it drives me absolutely crazy that we have to have 5-6 contribution agreements on a property. We just recently reviewed one where a municipal government was going to give us $140,000 for a project. So they're going to pay for the construction of a third of a unit. Mm-hmm. And we had to commit to 40 years of reporting on the whole site. They needed to be in first place on title.
40 grand.
They wanted to be ahead of the province and the federal government and any other lender for $140,000. Well, the answer is no. That we're going to spend more on reporting for 40 years than that amount of money to begin with. So those are the things that drive me absolutely crazy. I think we probably have some alignment around the table here of that's just unreasonable. And if the governments could figure out how to work together and have one contribution agreement, ironically back in 2004, 2005, we had that. The federal government said, here's the housing money. Here's what we want to do with it. They sent it to the province. The province sent it to the municipality, and the service manager wrote the agreement. We had one agreement.
So the lasagna is getting thicker and thicker, but
missing ingredients.
More layers, more ingredients missing. Yeah.
Oh,
okay, tell me a little bit more about the, what do you call it? The social impact bond?
Yeah, social impact bond.
Yeah, I mean, what, how can people... So I don't know. How can people contribute, and what are the terms?
Yeah, so you can go to our website and see the terms. We're giving people there's 4 different options. There's a really low entry point, so you can start with $1,000 at 3.5%. So
you're paying interest on this.
We're paying interest.
Okay.
Yeah, and then obviously, to administer $1,000 loan is costly, so that's why you don't get as high of an interest rate. But we really wanted it to be accessible for everybody. That could be a high school student with a summer job who says, it's 2 years before I need to go to university, and I have $1,000. So that's really what we wanted to start with there. But then it goes up through with higher rates. The good news for us is that our $6 million social impact bond is full. So we are looking at what's next for us. The intrigue and interest in it has given me really a lot of hope. And a lot of individuals, but other organizations and companies with similar values have come out of the woodwork. And so, pension funds have started asking, like, hey, maybe some of this should be invested in the neighborhoods where our people live. And mutual insurance companies who exist to help each other out and help a community out, who have large reserves. These are the things that are starting to come forward, and it's really given me some optimism about how we can financialize a different way forward.
Yeah, I mean, it's like crowdfunding for social housing, right? Like, it's a pretty cool idea, I think.
Yep.
And then, when you create that awareness, I think then probably a better chance if you create attracting more straight up donations as well. When people get familiar with what you're doing and be like, oh, okay, you know what? I actually have money that I can just donate rather than lend as well. So that's...
We certainly had that already as we're sending interest checks. A lot of people sent them back
really?
As a donation. And so that was a wonderful surprise as well.
Yeah.
There's another thing that's happening right now in the housing sector, and we haven't talked about that, and it's the collapse of the condo market.
Yeah.
And this is actually a really good opportunity for nonprofits. There is not a week that goes by that I don't have a contractor calling me and saying, I need work. I'm laying my guys off.
Okay.
And, I had a contractor say, listen, I will work for zero profit. I just need to keep my guys working so that when the construction industry comes back, I have labor. And I care about my guys, and I want them to be able to feed their families.
Yeah.
And certainly the men and women who build our buildings, we want to keep them working. And I think we have an opportunity. So I don't see that the costs are going to come down, but they certainly have plateaued.
So right now, what the current bottleneck? What is the current bottleneck for you? Because you said you want to be building more units. It's just funding, or
it is predictability of funding,
right?
And scale. So and then the other piece, in addition to, because the condo market has crashed, land is becoming available. So where we were 3-4 years ago, there was no land anywhere, and we're like, how do we find more land? It's there too. Developers.
Now there's options.
There's options.
And the same thing with staff. Like, are you having a hard or easy time getting people to staff your?
So I had to kind of nuance that question. When we open in a new region and we're unknown, it's always a challenge, because who's going to leave their job that they're good at and to go to somebody that they don't know? Once we've been established in a community, we're attracting really great staff. So new communities, it's hard, and then there's certain jobs that are difficult. Nurses are still hard to get. I think we got about 30 nurses on staff. Those are still in high demand. But for the rest, we have a dedicated people who want to, who believe in what we're doing, and that attracts people, a really good workforce.
Sorry, I'm just thinking.
We've been going for a while. We just keep asking questions.
Yeah, sorry. We'll wrap it up soon, Jeff. I promise. No, I'm just because my wife was a nurse for years, and she's not now. But I mean, like, would you take volunteer nurses? Like, people, if they had their certification still, there's room for people to volunteer.
Yeah, and
in
part-time.
Specific. Okay, interesting.
Yep.
That's a cool way to help out as well. Okay, sure. One more question. I'd be remiss if I didn't ask this. Do you accept Bitcoin? It's out of left field.
So, wow, I've never had that question asked. I almost never say no. So I would say I'd have to learn more about how we could utilize that most effectively.
Okay. I mean, there's organizations and people that I think that would help you if to be able to accept
I'll say one of the things that is growing is stocks, securities, transfer those, because that is our Canadian government really encourages that. With it's probably the most personally beneficial way to donate, because you're not paying the capital gains, and you're getting a tax receipt on the whole amount. So it is we're seeing that piece grow significantly.
So if I have a stock and it's appreciated considerably, I can donate that at the increased amount. But I'm not paying the capital gains.
Not paying the capital gains, and you get the donation receipt for the whole amount.
Okay. That's a pretty good deal.
It's a great deal.
Yeah. Okay, I think I'm out of questions, Brent. What about you?
Yeah, I'm good. We'll have to have you on again every Christmas. I think that's a good thing.
This has been a lot of fun.
Yeah, I bet you didn't think that when you got here. Okay, how can people find Indwell? How can they donate? What's the best? Just go to the website?
Yeah, indwell.ca is the best way. And then come get to know us. Come get involved. It's the beautiful part when we open a new building, and every one of our units always ends up having a handmade quilt. Sometimes original paintings on the wall, and toiletries, and the pantry full. And that's almost always because of volunteers and churches who come alongside and create a place of welcome for our new tenants. And that's just one of the ways that we can help other people out.
Yeah.
I will say, my church, Mercy, has been a little bit involved with Indwell as well, and in certain buildings that we're close to. And you want to share the gospel. This is you can share the gospel with somebody in a tent, and maybe they'll listen, maybe they won't. But if they actually have some support and some hope back in their lives, this is they're going to be much more receptive to hearing that message as well. Ultimately, for us as Christians, that's the best thing you can give somebody is the gospel, because that has an eternal, we talk about long-term thinking, long-term consequences. That's great in this life, and it's needed, and that's why we're here. We're stewards. But yeah, the best thing you can do is give somebody the gospel. And we've had those opportunities, and it's so cool to see the growth. There's disappointments too, and people turn away, but other people that you see the growth, and they want to come to church, and they want to hear the gospel. They want to become members. They profess their faith in Jesus. That is so cool. And there's you're also providing opportunities for that when churches get involved to help on a physical level. Yeah.
And, we talked about Jesus already here today, and Jesus says he's come to proclaim the good news. And what's that good news? The good news is transformative. And when someone's moving from a tent into a home, that's transformative, and they feel and experience good news. It's changed their life. And we're as a Christian organization, we're motivated by living out the gospel. We're very careful that we don't force anybody to participate in anything, but we invite people.
Yeah.
And it's far more effective when people are asking the question, why do you do this? And then we get to explain. That's why we are as an organization, is to follow the example of care and compassion of Jesus, and to help people to see, feel, live that in a very tangible way.
Sorry, my phone interrupting that point. But yeah, no, that's beautiful. And what better thing can we do, right?
Yep.
So, Jeff, I want to thank you for coming on. It's been great. Go to indwell.ca, I think. And we'll have it in the show notes as well for you. So thank you for your time. And for our listeners, until next time.
Steward your wealth wisely. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Two Stewards Show. If you like my voice better, click subscribe.
If you like my voice better, click share.
If you like both, give us a 5-star rating.
To learn more about the show, head on over to twostewards.ca and explore our free resources. To interact with the show, feel free to reach out at hello@twostewards.ca.
We will see you in the next episode. In the meantime, steward your wealth wisely.
Nailed it.